Good evening and welcome. Hello. God, you're miserable. Let's try that again. Good evening and welcome. It's not really in the heart, is it? Never mind. Good evening. Welcome to those on Zoom. My name is Mark Lanesmith. I'm Anglican chaplain up at the University of Reading, and you are at Café Théologique. Café Théologique, if you've not been before, we host in 0 Degrees Bar, a fantastic little restaurant and brewery in the centre of Reading. And we invite a theologian to come and justify their exorbitant salary. Yeah. We ask theologians to come along and talk about what they're doing in a sort of accessible way. And often the format that we have is an interview, and that tonight's going to be an interview. We're going to do an interview for 45 minutes. We'll pause then for you allowed to refresh your glasses and do other necessary things. And then we'll come back and we'll do Q&A until 9 o'clock. It's really lovely to see you here. Welcome. So our special guest today is Sarah Pritchard. Sarah's doing a master's degree down at Sarum College down in the southwest. And I came across Sarah's research when a friend of hers was giving a talk about trauma and body theology at the Abbey School for a former event. Welcome to Mark, who's the chaplain from the Abbey School. And it was recommended that we should invite Sarah to come along. So I've met with Sarah and we had a great conversation about a month or so ago. We prepared, I hope, a really interesting interview with you, for you. And our topic is Gloriously Fat, Christian Theology and the Fat Female Body. So let's welcome Sarah.
Hello, thank you for having me. I feel a bit nervous about being Pritchard.
It comes to us all, don't worry. Sarah, what's your background? How did you get into this strange theology thing?
Yeah, good question. So my undergrad theology, quite a long time ago now, my undergrad degree was in theology and youth work. So my background originally was church youth worker, and then stepped out of that and had children and kind of did that kind of life. And then I randomly saw an advert for a short course in trauma theology at Sarum College. And I'd never heard of trauma theology before, but was learning more about trauma and the effect that it has, and thought, oh gosh, the combination of trauma and theology could be super interesting. So I signed up for that. It was 3 hours on a Saturday afternoon. Did that, and my husband's self-employed, so he has an office at the bottom of the garden. So I had been at the bottom of the garden for 3 hours learning about trauma theology. Came up to the house and said, oh my gosh, I forgot how much I love theology. I think I need to do some more theology. And at that point started a conversation about what it might look like for me to do some further study, and that was in June, and I was on the MA course in the September at Sarum College. And so that's kind of where I got to. I guess part of me doing the MA is having kind of reevaluated over lockdown some of the stuff that I believed, and was very heavily involved in evangelical church culture for a long time, but a lot of that wasn't sitting well with me. We've been involved in foster care and working within that kind of system, and I think when you're presented with children whose lives don't match up, the kind of like, if you put everything in a neat box and tie the bow, everything's going to be fine, like that makes you question a lot about life. And I think that began me thinking, hang on a second, what do I really think?
There was a particular thing in lockdown I think you mentioned about, I think you described it as the bubble being pricked.
Yes, I think when you come out of certain spaces that you're in for a long time, which I think lockdown did for all of us, not going to church every Sunday, potentially accessing online stuff, but when you've got, when we had small children, online church just didn't actually work that well. Coming out of that space and having more time to reflect, I suddenly thought, you know what, a lot of this stuff doesn't actually work in life practically.
This stuff being
kind of like evangelical thought, the idea that God's working all things together for good and it'll all be okay in the end, and if you just pray hard enough then things will get better. A lot of those things didn't seem to be happening, and certainly for situations that were going on in our life at the time. And so I think that, combined with doing this short course in trauma theology, trauma theology is a really interesting area. If you haven't watched Karen's session on it from here, I'd really encourage you to go back, and that's a great introduction. Looking at how things that have happened in our lives affect the way that we do theology, the way that we think about theology. And suddenly it was very quick. It was suddenly and I was like, hang on a second, I'm not sure I believe any of this anymore. but I'm not prepared to give up on the faith that I have invested a lot of years in. So let's do an MA and work out what I really do believe. So yeah, that's where I am now. Yeah, it's a good habit, isn't it?
Brochures out,
yeah, we should have done.
So you're doing the MA.
I am.
And 2/3 of the way through.
I am. It's an MA in Christian spirituality. So it's a bit more, it's not just straight theology, it's looking at how that is applied to how people outwork their spirituality in the Christian faith.
And you're avoiding a dissertation?
I am currently avoiding a dissertation. No, I am. I'm in the third year. You have a year to write your dissertation. And I was just saying to Mark downstairs that my issue is I'm not a last minute person, but I do like a deadline, and the deadline is August. So I'm a little bit like, I've got ages. I haven't got ages. So I do need to crack on with some actual reading. But yeah, thanks for flagging that up.
Yeah, I've been trained in front of everybody now. Okay, now within the Masters in Spirituality, you chose to have a look at bodies.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
So one of the modules I did in my first year was a module called Relocating Religion. And that was a module that looked at where people find, I guess, their religion or their expression of religion if it's not in the church. And one of the tasks we had to do was come up with an idea for that, like give a 5-minute presentation. So because of my life experience at that point, I immediately thought about slimming groups and diet culture and how people definitely commit themselves to a certain way of life through that. And then I ended up writing my essay for that module on that as well. So looking at how diet culture and theology were, I proposed, intertwined. Yeah.
How is diet culture quasi-religious?
So yeah, my personal experience is going to diet clubs and stuff. If you've experienced anything like that or any kind of online stuff, the idea is that you give your life to it. You commit your whole life to this way of eating, to this way of doing things. Certain diet clubs, there's a particular language that you pick up. I'm not going to mention things specifically because I don't want to get us in any trouble. But names for things that sound very religious, and every week you go and you stand on the scales, and you've got this ritual that happens, and people sit in a group and share about their experiences. It's actually a very religious experience. And there's a theologian called Hannah Bacon who is at Chester Uni, I think, and she's written an amazing, done some amazing research into a specific slimming group and the religious connections there, which is really great. And I wanted to look a bit more about how diet culture has kind of infiltrated the church, I guess, or how that's tied up with church practices, and reflecting on some of my own experience within that as well. So yeah,
and particularly the concept of sin, and I guess something like guilt, I would imagine.
Yeah, definitely. So the idea of eating bad things, eating good things. Food is often within diet culture separated into good and bad food. This food is good for you, this food is bad for you, and you feel guilty, or I've had a bad day, and you're literally talking about the food that you've eaten, and then you're making a moral judgment on yourself based on the fact that you chose a packet of crisps over an apple. Yeah, so
that's interesting. Just as you're talking about it, it took me to an image of Eve in a garden.
Yeah, I wasn't intentionally. Yeah, but yeah, no, you're right. Yeah, it's all there. See.
As you hinted, that there is a personal angle. You know this from the inside, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. My experience of having lived in a bigger body, pretty much all of my life. And the problem with diet culture is that it talks about a thin ideal that everything will be better when you reach a certain point. And for different people, that will be different things. I think we'll talk about the BMI scale in a minute. But that idea that perfection comes, your life will be better when, everything will make sense when, you'll feel this sense of achievement, and all of the things that are an issue in your life will fall into place when you reach this number on a scale. And the reality is that isn't true. Like, that doesn't happen. They countless stories of people who reach that number on the scale and like, why don't I feel any different? All the things I dislike about myself are still exactly the same. My body just looks a bit different. And I think the issue with diet culture is that it presents this idea of happiness around the size of your body. And it also encourages you to hate your body, to, not like it very much when you step on a scale and you put a pound on that week and you think, oh gosh, my body's really let me down. It's that separation of mind and body, and the idea that your body needs to submit to what you want to do. Yeah, it's not healthy.
So we're really into implicit theology already there.
I know, it's there. You don't have to dig very deep, and it's right there. because we're going to talk about dualism and the idea, Plato. And I am not a kind of historic theologian, so my knowledge about these ideas are not great, but I do know that Christianity is flooded with the idea that the body submits to the mind, spirit and body are separate, and that body is lesser. And actually, what feminist theology encourages, and what I think is really important, is that idea of embodiment, that it's all one and the same. It's not body submit. It's not you're holier if you get your body to punish your body or get your body to do certain things. Actually, it's our whole body is a spiritual act. Our whole body is involved in how we relate to God. And I think diet culture encourages that separation in a really unhelpful way.
And I think I picked up from you also when we spoke, it sort of colonizes not just the mind and the psychology, it's in your wallet as well. Is it quite expensive? But there's some money to be made in.
There's an awful lot of money to be made in women hating their bodies at the end of the day. You don't have to look very far. I'm sure we could walk down a street in Reading and see some billboards for something which will encourage mostly women to modify their body. Attending swimming groups is an expensive commitment, shakes, diet pills, all of that stuff. It's all about mostly women. There are men involved, but it is a business that is mostly aimed at women to reduce their bodies. And the reality is that 95% of diets just don't work. If diets worked, there wouldn't be people in bigger bodies around, because they'd have done a diet and their body would no longer be big. But the reality is 95% of diets do not work. And therefore it's become this amazing industry, and you get people that, try this diet, try that diet, they'll come back to this one, try it again. And they're just literally throwing money after money and still not getting the results that they want and feeling worse and worse about themselves.
I'm interested, this is a tangential question I didn't ask you before, but have you met anybody who's on the selling side of it?
That's a good question. I've met, so obviously, like, if you go to diet groups, you meet, they call them consultants. I've met some people that are higher up in that, and they're not great. They're not amazing people. I wasn't hugely impressed with their demeanor. There's also an element of often, they're living in bigger bodies themselves, and you think you're making money off of telling people they should be smaller. And actually, if this diet works, surely it would work for you. If this is the diet that you're selling, then would it not work for you? And that's, having been out of it for quite a few years and reflecting back on it, there was a time where I could have, told you the points value of every food going. I don't live that life now, and I'm very thankful not to. But there are, there'll be lots of people who, will be online, not probably not watching this, but potentially will say, oh, but if you just did this, if you just did it harder, if you just did it for longer, then. But the reality is they just don't work.
Let's talk about BMI. You mentioned the 3 initials.
Yeah, so diet culture is mostly based around this premise of BMI, body mass index, which I would imagine if you've been in the UK for any amount of time, you'll be familiar with. And lots of healthcare is around it. So your doctor's very concerned about your BMI, and if you've got a higher BMI, it's a bad thing, and you're a bad person, and you must get your BMI down. And that's not to say that there aren't correlations between weight and some health issues, but the reality of the BMI scale is it was created by a Belgian mathematician, and he created it to make judgments on vast groups of people, so huge swathes of people. It's never meant to be a way of judging an individual's health, I guess. And it was also entirely based on white males' bodies. So there is absolutely no nuance, there's no intersectionality. If you've got hips, you're screwed, basically. If you come from any other, different cultural background, different race, this scale was not based on your body. And so therefore our entire health system and all of the diet culture is based on getting down to a weight which is pretty much based on a white man's body. And that's, people are laughing here, you don't have to look very far and see why that's an issue.
What date did you say that was?
Oh gosh, the date,
20th century?
Long ago enough that we could be coming up with a different scale by now. And actually, really interesting, the American Health Organization very recently, I think June time, have come out to say that the BMI is no longer to be used as the sole measure of health. So they'll still use it, but it's really important that that's known, because we're not at that place in the UK yet where where weight, but you know, basically the relationship of my weight and my height equals my health. And America have now said we're not only going to use that, we'll look at some other factors as well. So that's good.
Are there other indices being used then?
I don't know about other indices, but I think it, you know, obviously like mental health and that kind of stuff is important. Yeah, so they're kind of bringing in other kinds of assessment. But yeah.
Which I was astonished by, because I guess like probably most of us, we assumed it's scientific.
Yeah, and no, it was, you know, obviously there's a relationship between maths and science, but it was created by a mathematician. Yeah. Pardon? 1850.
1850.
There you go.
There you go.
Yeah, thank you.
What
was that?
Wikipedia, which may not be accurate. We mentioned a bit of philosophy a while ago, Plato.
Yeah.
Why is Plato a problem?
So Plato is the origin of this dualistic thinking, this idea that your body is subject to your mind or your soul, and that the job of the soul is to conquer the body, I guess, and that they're two separate entities, and they have, you know, in one sense the body is earthly and the soul is the heavenly being that will, you know, is your spiritual, the way that you engage spiritually, and is the bit that really matters, and that your body is arbitrary. I mean that's all the way through Christian thought. You know, lots of the ways we interpret scripture is through that idea that, you know, our soul is the bit that we're concerned about and our body is arbitrary, and it's just our means of being on the earth, and there'll come a point where, you know, that's not important. We'll have a new body, so this body, yeah.
I guess people will recognise that sort of dualism, that metaphysical dualism, body and soul. And we do live it, don't we? We use it a lot.
Yeah, definitely.
It's not the only thing in scripture, though, because I think the Hebrew approach to bodies and spirits is rather different.
So some of the stuff that I looked at for the my assignment was looking at how like Old Testament understanding of bodies, and we haven't talked about it yet, but looking at the word glutton and how, you know, the 7 deadly sins and gluttony, and what does that mean for people in bigger bodies. And really interestingly, when I was looking at some of the stuff with regards to the Old Testament, there was this recognition, that's not a word.
Recognition.
Thank you. I knew that wasn't a word. Recognition. That actually in Old Testament times, people could look at people in bigger bodies and not make a judgment about the sort of person they were. So nowadays, you get to the idea that if someone lives in a bigger body, they must be greedy, they must be out of control, they must not be able to control their eating habits. And we maybe don't use the word glutton as much, but that idea that if you live in a bigger body, then, you know, there's something wrong with you. You know, you're not controlling yourself, you're not disciplined. But actually in Old Testament times, there was this understanding that gluttony was about your attitude and the sort of person that you were. And so they could separate the idea that someone might live in a bigger body and actually the size of their body wasn't to do with their character. And I think that's a really important distinction to make when we're talking about gluttony in the way that we understand it today.
There was a particular figure you mentioned when we chatted, Evagrius.
Yes, Evagrius. So he is the guy that first came up with the idea of the 7 deadly sins, which that wasn't his name. And there were 8, I think, originally when he came up with them. Don't ask me what the extra one is. So his idea of gluttony was drawing everything to yourself because you were concerned that you wouldn't be provided for. So the idea that you would eat loads of food because you weren't sure if God would provide for you or not. So therefore you just kind of store it all up for yourself, and other people wouldn't be provided for. So it wasn't about the size of body or really even about the fact that you were eating all of the food. It was that attitude that you weren't sure if God would provide for you. So
it's almost a lack of faith, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
So it's talking about your approach to life. It's not actually talking about food.
And it's character again. It's that idea of what do your actions say about what you're believing?
So that comes down to modern ideas about gluttony being a sin, and the way that we tend to think of it now is about overeating.
It's about overeating.
But origins are not wrong.
Well, as I understand it, and I'm sure there's more research that could be done, but my understanding is that the origins of gluttony is about an attitude of heart as opposed to an action or an amount of food that you've eaten.
We've talked a little about the Old Testament. Let's skip through to the New, because there's one potentially very toxic phrase, that your body being a temple of the Holy Spirit.
In Corinthians, So yeah, there's this great phrase by Paul about your body being a temple of the Holy Spirit. And this verse has been used by lots of people in the church to suggest that a temple of the Holy Spirit wouldn't be overweight and it wouldn't be a bigger body. So therefore, if you live in a bigger body, then you're not following God's ways, you're not following God's best, that your body is a lesser temple. And there's some really bonkers diets that have been created off the back of this. So if we're grounding it in practice, there's mostly from America, but they've certainly crept over here. When I first started doing this research, quite a few friends were like, oh my gosh, there's this book and there's this book. Those of us that have grown up in kind of Christian culture for a long time. There's one, Free to be Slim. There's another one called What Would Jesus Eat? There's actually a diet called What Would Jesus Eat? There's another one, the Daniel diet, the Way Down diet. The Way Down diet is a really interesting one. And that in the literature for that one, it actually says fat is sin. Like it's that, that brutal, basically.
Rick Warren has been involved.
So he's the Daniel, so Rick Warren wrote I think this is the Daniel diet. And I found this really difficult to read, actually. When you read the introduction to his diet book, it talks about one day when he's a mega church leader, or was a mega church leader in America. And he talks about baptizing some members of his church who were overweight. And he reflects on, this is in the introduction to the book, he reflects on how tired he was at the end of that and thought, do you know what, I need to do something about this. I don't want to carry on baptizing fat, literally saying, I don't want to carry on baptizing fat people, so I'm going to write a diet for my church. So he writes, he's a popular guy, writes his diet, sells loads.
For those who are not on Zoom or watching it, the eyebrows raising.
Yeah, there's a
thing going on.
I just thought, gosh, imagine if I was one of those people that was baptized that morning, and then this guy's gone and written a diet plan because like baptizing me was such an issue for him. It's an amazing spiritual moment. Like, I've committed my life to God. I'm, repenting of my sin, and then like this guy's written a diet. I mean, it's just horrendous. The pastoral implications are unending. It's not good.
And if we were to say, okay, that's not really what Paul was wanting to say with that phrase, what was he wanting to say with this stuff about?
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to read many commentaries to see that Paul's getting at sexual immorality. That's what he's talking about. That passage is about that. And when he's talking about bodies being a temple of the Holy Spirit, he's referring to, sexual immorality. Just discuss what he meant by that for days, but he's not talking about people in big bodies. And so the fact that Christian culture has enabled, interesting interpretations of that verse have resulted in diets being written is really problematic.
Something which should be liberating becomes controlling.
Yes, definitely.
That's quite often with the church, isn't it?
Sadly, so.
So the first part of our interview, we've been doing the sort of deconstructive stuff, sort of taking apart some of these allegories, how they come from. Let's just go into this path.
Okay. Linda Baker's an American woman, and it's basically like it's a different approach to healthcare, a different approach to the way that we look at our bodies, based on 3 key principles, which is accepting our bodies as they are, enjoying food for nourishment and enjoyment, and then introducing health promoting habits. So rather than looking at what we need to take away, so our bodies needing to be less, looking at what we need to add into our bodies. But that first step of accepting our bodies as they are is the key one, because you can't move on to the other steps until you've accepted your body as it is. Because the minute you think about adding extra things in, becomes problematic if you haven't accepted your body as it is in its current state or current form.
Where does this come from? It's American, you said?
Yeah, she's a psychologist, I think. Working with people in bigger bodies.
And fairly recent?
Yeah, semi-recent. Yeah, I think, I think 90s. So what I did in my essay and in the paper that I then gave at a conference over the summer was took those principles and then kind of applied them theologically. So I thought, well, what does it look like to have a health at every size approach to the body within Christian theology? What does it look like? So drawing on lots of feminist theology, looking at the idea of embodiment and just appreciate our bodies for what they are, and actually looking at our bodies and saying our bodies are amazing things. They allow us to do so much. They allow us to exist in this life. They allow us to come to Café Théologique and talk about theology, and but not not having that attitude towards our bodies that they need to be controlled, or that they're lesser, or that they're a problem, but actually saying my body is an amazing thing as it is now. I'm going to love it and care for it. So drawing on lots of feminist theology and looking at saying, we're not going to say to female bodies specifically that it needs to look like this, or it needs to be like this, or needs to conform to these norms. And then drawing in food and nourishment, and we talked about the idea of Jesus gathering people around a table, and that being the Christian faith is based on a meal. And for lots of people that are deconstructing out of diet culture, meals are really tricky because they're always thinking calories or points, or so actually making the church a place where meals can be enjoyed and celebrated, and that people of all shapes and sizes feel welcome. And then health creating habits. So in terms of spirituality, that could be all sorts of things, but retreats and meals with friends and trying new recipes, and that kind of stuff.
So shifting from something which is about oppression and control, a very strong negative message that's about splitting you up in your body and mind, and it's turning that completely upside down. And
saying, what can I add into my life that's going to bring fullness and it's going to be a really good thing for me. And I love that idea of health creating habits, because it is literally about what am I going to add in. So it might well be like, I'm going to add in more vegetables and fruit because they make me feel really good, and when I eat them, I can feel the benefits in my body. But you're doing that because it's a positive thing. You're not doing it because you're trying to reduce anything about your body. And the idea of exercise. There's a great woman on Instagram called Tally Ryan. She talks about exercise in a real positive way. So it's not about pushing your body to the limits, but it's saying, when I exercise, I feel good about myself. I get this rush of endorphins. And she really, really pushes the whole idea that you're not pushing your body to its limits. If your body hurts, you stop, because you're doing movement that's causing your body to hurt. But actually going on a walk is as valuable and as valid as going to a gym for an hour and pushing your body to its absolute limits. Actually, exercise should be enjoyable. It shouldn't be a chore. It shouldn't cause you to make your body submit.
And as you say that, I suddenly was taken back to, I did medieval studies for my master's degree. So got the number of women mystics who are celebrated for what they do to their bodies. And back in the, this isn't my area of expertise, but back in medieval times, the whole idea was that women were to make their bodies as masculine as possible, and that would be the holy body. And that's hugely problematic, isn't it? But it's, some of the mystics did things to their bodies and refused to eat because they wanted to get away from the kind of patriarchal. If they could be a mystic and holy, then they could do away from the kind of men telling them what to do. And the reality is, in our situation, women are doing things to their bodies and denying themselves and trying to make themselves thin, and that is sadly all down to what the patriarchy says a woman should look like. There's a real flip there, which I find really interesting and actually really sad. That in medieval times you had these amazing mystics who were like, it's not for me, I'm going to just go and align myself with God. And actually the opposite is now true. You mentioned Jesus.
So I was like,
actually, there's quite a lot going on with food around Jesus, isn't there? It's not as we might think, taking a sort of platonic thing that's just on the side, and what he's really doing is to tell you some information. It's actually ripped right the way through his ministry, isn't it?
And Jesus was a guy that was accused of being a drunkard. He was at parties, he was at the places where people shouldn't be. And he gathered people around meals often. He took a little boy's lunch and split it so that everybody had enough. If you look at Jesus' ministry, there's so much of it that centers food and drink and celebration, and there isn't that sense of there not being enough. There's always enough. The feeding the 5,000, there was more left over at the end. And that's not to say that people should gorge themselves, but it's to say that it's a plentiful faith, the Christian faith. So the idea that that's crept into theology that says that we need to eat less and do less, actually that's not at the core of our faith. Our faith is a plentiful faith where there's always enough.
Makes me think that there's an old film that I remember watching. It used to be a statement of retreats, Babette's Feast.
I haven't seen that.
Set in the 18th century, somebody will Google it now. 18th century Denmark, I think, or Scandinavian country, very puritanical, very quiet. there's hot in colour. It's all sort of dark shades. In comes a woman who's been a chef, I think in Versailles or Paris, and she's lost all her money. And she just has to work as a chef. And then one day I think she wins the lottery. She gets lots of money, and so she tells these very puritanical people she'd like to make them a meal. And the film is about the making of this meal that is absolutely transformative. And you watch these very puritanical, very Protestant figures, very dour, discover desire and joy and enjoyment. Babette speaks. A bit like Chocolat. Yeah, Chocolat is sort of updating. Yeah. Yeah. Where were we? We lost our way. Sorry.
No. Film reviews.
Film reviews. My next question: what might God say to the fat or the pregnant body? How does God look at our bodies? Do you think?
Well, I think God's very positive about our bodies. Yeah, I've written a chapter for a book which is coming out next year, reflecting on my experience of being pregnant and fat and how that's gone in the health system and theologically as well. So the idea that sadly, the pregnant fat body isn't celebrated within the UK. You put on all sorts of different plans, and it's not a great experience. But actually, there was a life inside me that I believed God was a part of. So just playing with that theologically. So yeah, I think God is really positive about the fat female body. I think God wants to celebrate it. I think it's an area that is a bit awkward sometimes, because within the UK we're taught that fat people, they're a drain on the NHS, there are this, there are that. Actually, if we unpack some of that, I think we need to look at what God says about human beings, across the board. I believe that God celebrates human beings and is, a part of their creation. I think that's all super positive. There's a theologian called Nicola Slee, who I'm sure lots of people have heard of. She wrote a book celebrating the risen Christa, so looking at the idea of Jesus in female form. And one of the poems she writes, she does lots of poetry as her reflections, is about the fat Christa. And I found that really formative in the work that I've been doing, because she talks about this voluptuous woman who's confident in her folds and rolls and who's breastfeeding a baby. And you just get this, it's only a really short poem, but within the two stanzas, it's just this beautiful picture of this woman who is content and full and has much to offer the world. And I think that's the kind of thing that God would be saying about the fat female body.
Okay, we're going to pause. That's a good place to pause. We can take about 10 minutes. So we're going to restart at 20 past. Plenty to think about. Do talk to your neighbours, come up with some questions, and then we'll be passing the microphones around. For those on Zoom, taking the break yourself, you can put comments in the chat, and Ray here will read out your questions. So let's just pause.